I'm Sienna. I'm the kid.
I'm Sarah. I'm the mom.
This is Queer Kid Straight Mom.
Let's talk. Welcome back to Queer Kids Straight Mom. Since it is almost October, we're talking about some horror movies. If you are newer to listening to our podcast and didn't hear the episode that we did previously about queerness and horror movies, a little background is just that there's always been this like tie between queerness and horror because, for one thing, back when the Hays Code was in practice and you couldn't portray gay characters in movies, these misfit characters that were perceived as being monsters or sometimes actually were monsters often served sort of a metaphorical role for what it was like to be gay in a unaccepting society and time. So we ended up watching a group of movies from a whole span of time periods that all have female characters that are misfits or feel that they don't belong or are scared of who they are. And we're going to talk about those roles, these stories, and how they relate to the queer experience. We started out with a movie called Cat People from 1942. Fascinating. In this movie, the main character is from Serbia, and when she meets the love interest and starts talking about her experience, we find out that she comes from a village that was tormented by the tale of sort of demonic cat people, women that could turn into cats and kill people that they were angry with. And she is terrified that she might be one of them.
I mean, and what's like also sort of important, and it's not very explicit because it's old, but it's not just like, oh, people they're angry with. The turning into a cat is also sort of linked to like sexuality. And so
Right.
The way it's framed in the movie is that, oh, if she kisses her husband, she'll turn into a cat, which is obviously, old-timey speak for sexual awakening being a trigger for turning into a cat.
Yes.
And not just like a kill cat, like a panther, to be clear.
Right. There's this scene where they're at a Serbian restaurant and this woman is across the room, this like really glamorous woman. And the guys are like, ooh, look at her. And then one of them says, she looks like a cat. And as she walks by, she stares at Irina, the main character, and says something in Serbian and leaves. And Irina's freaking out. And her husband says, what did she say to you? And she said, sister. So this is like, stoking her fear that woman was one of the cat people and that she also is, because this woman saw something in her that she is terrified might be true. Run with the metaphor. So anyway, I don't know. This was fascinating. Sienna, what did you walk away from this movie with?
Well, I thought it was very silly, honestly, because
Cat people?
well, because she goes to this therapist that her husband's friend, who turns out to be in love with her husband, recommends, because they're all like, you are convinced that you're going to turn into a cat. That's concerning. You should do something about that. And then the therapist is like a terrible therapist, which I guess probably all therapists in the 30s were. But he tells her she's making everything up and then is like, you're trying to trick me by acting scared, I guess.
Yeah. Oh, right. And I forgot there's the part where he says all she needs to do is get rid of her cat stuff and live her life, which, like, we agreed totally sounds like something J.D. Vance would say to a lesbian.
Yes, if you just get rid of all your cat pictures, then life will be normal. And fix your relationship with your husband. And inexplicably, she seems to think that, yes, that is the solution. And then she's no longer scared. And then she goes home to her husband and her husband's like, oh, glad you figured that out. Unfortunately, actually, I'm in love with my best friend, so we should get divorced. And that has been kind of the driver throughout the movie of her actually turning into a cat, right? She refuses to kiss her husband because she's like, oh no, I'll turn into a cat. But her husband is spending all this time with this other lady and it's like making her jealous. And so then she starts like turning into a cat and stalking the lady, which honestly that seems totally reasonable, actually. Like, yeah, it's not, I mean, you should eat your husband probably because he's the one who's being a jerk here, but it's not unreasonable to be upset that your husband is just hanging out with some other lady and then is like, haha, actually, it's like, I don't like you anymore. Bye.
Yeah, that was bizarre. The husband was like, actually, this whole thing has made me realize that I love Alice. Like, what, your wife being scared of turning into a cat? You were like, oh, wait, Alice is normal. I love her. Like, what was that?
Well, and it's not like she ever seemed normal to begin with. Like, she was always weird.
Yeah, she was
It's
a
just,
little
yeah.
off.
The highlight of the movie was so in one of their therapy sessions, you know, the like, if I kiss my husband, I'll turn into a cat comes up. And then the therapist is like, okay, and what if I were to kiss you? And she's like, I don't know. I only know that I should not like to be kissed by you. And then blah, 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 fast forward. And then he's like, shows up in her apartment. And then she turns into a cat and kills him. It's great.
So, yeah, there's a lot to work with. Clearly, woman is scared of who she really is. It makes her not want to be intimate with her husband. She has an uncomfortable connection with another woman.
Well, and I mean, if I'm remembering correctly, that's sort of the turning point in the movie when she sees that other woman. Like after that, she starts actually turning into a cat and stuff.
So it's like, even though it terrified her, it awakened something in her too.
Mm,
Yeah. Interesting one. Do we recommend or not?
I don't know. I mean, I'm personally not like a huge old film person. I found it hard to be that invested in any of them. But
Fair.
I don't know, if you like old films, I guess you might enjoy it.
It's not the worst old horror movie I've ever seen. So next, working our way forward in time, is the classic Carrie from 1976, which many more of you will probably have seen than saw cat people. But if you're not familiar with it, there is a girl who is a little odd, a little off, raised by this like very alarmingly religious mother. And
I want to say Christian fundamentalist, but she's not even really a fundamentalist because half the stuff she talks about is just completely made up.
yeah, strange stuff going on there. Anyway, this poor girl is like tormented by her classmates, but one of them feels bad and tells her boyfriend that he should take Carrie to the prom so she can go have fun and feel accepted, which seems like a really questionable plan. Meanwhile, the gym teacher has punished this whole class of girls for tormenting Carrie. And one of the girls is so angry with the gym teacher, and they have to do the punishments or they can't go to prom. And she's so angry, she refuses to do it, but she really wants to get back at Carrie. So she doesn't get to go to prom. She finds out Carrie's going to prom, and she comes up with the whole plan of pouring a bucket of pig's blood over Carrie as she receives the really hard to believe they made this happen award of prom queen.
No, they just like faked all the ballots.
Well, I know, but still, like, maybe it's just the level of investment to be mean to somebody is.
They also killed a pig.
Well, that's true. Yeah, I know. That might have been the most upsetting thing for me. I'm so mad at you. I'm going to go kill an innocent pig.
In fairness, the pigs were all going to die anyway. What's really stupid is that they smashed its head in with a hammer, which is not an effective way of collecting blood.
I'm assuming never mind. I don't even want to talk about it. So Carrie has been finding out through the movie that she can make things happen with her mind, which has, normally just been like when she gets mad at her mom, something will break. Or like at school with the other girls, she makes the light explode. But she's realizing that she has these powers, which make her threaten her mom and stand up to her. And then also when she gets a bucket of pig's blood poured on her, makes her go completely homicidal and kill everybody.
In fairness, almost everybody deserved it.
I felt kind of bad for the gym teacher.
I mean, yeah, the gym teacher didn't deserve it, but everybody else deserved it.
Most of them. I think the guy, like, wasn't her date like actually trying to be nice?
No, but I think he died because the bucket fell on his head.
That actually killed him. I thought he was just.
Think so. If you think about it, a metal bucket, probably heavier because like things were heavy back in ye olden times.
That wasn't a Walmart bucket.
Like a big metal bucket falling from 15 feet above you directly on your head.
Okay. So he died, but like it wasn't her fault.
Right. That's my interpretation. It was kind of confusing.
It was chaos.
No, he was lovely. That's the sad thing.
Yeah. What is your queer interpretation of this movie?
Well, I mean, I think what has been sticking with me is that it's like the whole thing is almost the opposite of doomed by the narrative. Like, there are so many points where things didn't have to go the way they did, you know? That, like, it's just this really tragic confluence of people trying to do nice things and people trying to do bad things, and the people trying to do nice things and the people trying to do bad things just like fall together in such a way that it goes really badly for everyone. But I mean, I think it's interesting because that places an emphasis on agency, right? And the way that, like, it's not like a Greek tragedy where everyone's just kind of like tugged along by fate and has no ultimate control over their actions, like Oedipus or something. It's like a Shakespearean tragedy where everybody has control over their actions and it's the control over their actions that dooms them, which I just think is interesting. I mean, because there are so many moments where things could have gone differently. Obviously, the one girl not trying to be nice and get Carrie to prom and make her happy, which I mean, ironically did work. Like, she was happy for a minute, which is what makes it really sad. And then the gym teacher not trying to be nice and telling Carrie to go to prom and getting her to go to prom. And then the gym teacher not trying to protect Carrie by getting the nice girl out of the gym, thereby stopping her from stopping the girl from dumping pig's blood on her. The boyfriend not trying to be nice by comforting Carrie would have stopped him from getting a bucket dropped on his head. And I mean, I thought that was a really interesting turning point because I don't think she would have gone crazy if it weren't for that. I think that, like, he would have acted as like evidence that not everyone was against her.
Mm.
And like he would have stood up for her, and then that would have sort of prevented everything from spiraling out. But it didn't, right? He gets a bucket dropped on his head, and then, yeah. And then, I mean, even at the end of the movie, like, because I mean, what happens after that is then she goes home, and then her mom's like, haha, you're a witch, I'm gonna kill you. And she ends up killing her mom, and then like the house gets sucked down into the earth, and then they both die or whatever. Her mom not being a terrible person and trying to kill her daughter and just being like, I'm so sorry this happened to you.
Right. Like a normal human being might do.
Like, yeah, I mean, and so that emphasis on human agency, I think, is really interesting because, of course, like, queerness is also ultimately very tied to agency. And I think that framing of things is kind of interesting. Yeah, I thought that was kind of the most compelling element of the movie. And then also the way that the nice girl is framed is really interesting to me because at the beginning of the movie, the mom goes over to this girl's house and like talks to her mom and is like trying to get her to convert or whatever. And then basically says like, your daughter is so sinful and evil and terrible. because I don't know, she's like a normal teenage girl or something. I don't know. And yet, actually, it sort of sets up this contrast because actually, this girl is like the only person trying to do nice things for Carrie. And then what I thought was really interesting is that at the end of the movie, like the very last scene, we see her walking up to the place where Carrie's house used to be, and there's like a for sale cross on it. And yeah, there's like a lot of religious imagery, but one of them being that she's like walking up with flowers and she's framed in a very angelic way. Like there's literally like white light radiating off of her. And so it's just this really interesting contrast with, with the mom who is supposedly religious, but I mean everything about her is terrifying. She's terrifying. All of her religious imagery is terrifying. She's all like crazy murder, murder, murder. And then you have this girl who she has claimed is like evil or whatever. And she's like literally framed as heavenly. What really makes this interesting is if you consider the possibility that maybe this girl is queer, because think about it. If she were like so desperately in love with this guy, I don't believe that they're really dating, because why would she tell her boyfriend to go with prom? Why wouldn't she find like another guy to go to prom with her? Surely there are other not terrible men in this school that she could be like, hey, you want to do this thing? I don't know, I'll give you $50 or whatever. Because it's not like initially he was doing it out of the goodness of his heart. He was like, oh, she asked me to. So anyway, I think she's queer. And because we also don't see any kind of jealousy at all, right?
Yeah.
She's literally like, they're all like kissing and staring into each other's eyes lovingly and dancing around the prom. And she's just like happy.
Yeah. Yeah. I thought that was
Anyway,
odd.
so therefore, I think she's queer. I think she's a lesbian. And that makes this contrast between the mom and her even more interesting.
So at the end of the movie, because you've probably seen it. If you haven't, you probably know most everything about it.
And also, like, don't listen to these episodes if you don't want spoilers.
Right. Or just like skip this part because it's a spoiler. But so she's laying the flowers on the grave, and then all of a sudden this arm reaches out of the ground and grabs her and is like pulling her towards it. And then she wakes up. So this could go one of two ways, depending on whose hand that was. Right?
Oh, that's an interesting point.
If it was the mom, it's telling us that, like, there was that contrast of the really, like, quote unquote, holy person being like really sort of demonic, and then a normal, kind, possibly queer teenage girl being angelic, and her trying to drag her into the ground. But if it was Carrie, is this like some sort of morality tale? You will get dragged down by the misfits, by the whatever.
I mean, yeah, it could go either way. I mean, it's also worth keeping in mind that, like, regardless, she also has basically been punished for trying to do a nice thing, right? Like, literally all her classmates and her boyfriend slash friend slash whatever are all dead.
Right. Because let's say that also Carrie's oddness and misfitness and all of that stuff, like, let's say that's a metaphor for the, like, outsider status of gay people. If the person who is trying to reach out to her and be kind to her and be compassionate is surrounded by death, and then she tries to drag her down too, like, is that like, stay away from those people or this is what will happen to you?
But it's interesting because, I mean, it's hard to imagine that that's the intention because, like, the mom is so negatively portrayed.
Yeah, and also she's the one that Sue, the girl that was trying to be nice, she's the one that survives. There's a lot to dissect there.
Yeah, and I mean, there are a lot of dichotomies. I mean, right, like I said, a lot of religious imagery. Maybe one of the most obvious ones is Okay, so she has this closet that she sticks Carrie in to like make her pray or whatever for hours. This
As
is
all good God-fearing mothers do.
yes, obviously. And there's this terrifying like crucifix in there.
Glowing eyes.
He's like, yeah, anyway, it's so scary. Again, like I said, like all of the religious iconography in this house is terrifying. But then at the end, like when the mom tries to kill Carrie, Carrie reacts in self-defense basically and like telepathically uses a bunch of kitchen implements to stab her, which I mean, I guess is another yet again, we have a woman who's sort of demonic evil power that destroys the people around her, like a completely rational response actually. But anyway, so her mom ends up like impaled to the door frame in the exact same pose that this crucifix in the closet is in. And one of the last images we have, like as the house sinks into the ground, is this crucifix and like in the same position as the mother, and it has the same hair as the mom, which is like, I mean, notable because who has ever seen a crucifix where Jesus has bushy curly hair? I have not. So anyway, yeah, it's like just this really interesting so like these contrasts and comparisons being drawn in really interesting places.
Yeah, well, and all the like the mom and the religion and all the like shame and like women are horrible temptresses and you're marked with sin and like all of that like shame stuff is like kind of feels kind of relevant too.
Right. I mean, where this all starts is that Carrie gets her period while she's in the shower and she has no idea what's happening because her mother has neglected to tell her that that's a thing that happens, because apparently her mother believes that if you're just like a good, pricely, pure woman, then you will never get a period. There's so much about her worldview that makes absolutely no sense. Even like even within a lot of Christian fundamentalist circles, there the way sex is viewed isn't this puritanical. Most of that negativity is directed towards sex outside of marriage. But, obviously, like Christianity also places a substantial emphasis on reproduction. And she seems to think that even like sex for the purpose of reproduction is evil.
Yeah, like she seems to be fundamentally traumatized by having like had a baby.
I mean, in fairness, the suggestion is basically that Carrie's dad raped her mom.
Yeah.
But I mean, this is one of those things that I would really like to read the book now, actually, because I imagine there are I find film more ambiguous and difficult to dissect than books because just because there are things that get lost. And so I really want, like, I feel like reading the book would reveal maybe which of those ambiguous elements are deliberate and which ones are just things not coming across clearly.
Yeah, that would be interesting.
But if you can't tell, this was definitely my favorite of the 4 movies we watched.
Yeah, I had seen it before, but it was a long time. I didn't remember a lot of that stuff.
There's so much, imagery and
Yeah.
like, I mean, the dramatic irony, right? Where you are seeing this girl be happy for literally the first time in her life, and yet also simultaneously knowing what's literally about to come crashing down on her head. Like, it engaged me emotionally in a way that like none of the other ones really did.
Which like is that I keep going back to like trying to figure out the intention of this, but was that like you're not allowed to be happy? If you try, there will be consequences?
Yeah, and I mean, again, it's an interesting parallel though, right? Because you have the person who tells her that, which is her mom, and then you have the people who make it happen, but it's not like it had to happen,
Yeah. So people are just awful.
apparently.
All right. The next movie is called Heavenly Creatures, and it's from 1994. I watched it when I was in college in the late 90s, and I didn't want to watch it again. So Sienna just watched it the other night. So you're going to have to summarize this one because it's been a while.
Okay, fun fact, don't even bother trying to look it up because the only way you can stream it is illegally on YouTube, which I definitely did not do, or like getting a video copy off of Vudu and like having it shipped to you.
I think I rented it from Blockbuster when I watched it. So there were perks to Blockbuster.
Side note that yes, among the several disadvantages of streaming is that sometimes movies get lost in the cracks of all the various, like the Swiss cheese of various different streaming services and rights and copyrights and all that stuff. And this happens to be one of those movies, which, yeah, it's unfortunate actually, because I think there are a lot of really good movies that that's the case for. So, yeah, real bummer. But yeah, so basically, what this is it's a little bit borderline true crime, I guess, artistic true crime. Well, this murder case in New Zealand where there are these two girls who become friends and have this really intense relationship that's sort of based on this fantasy world that they are creating in a novel that they're writing. And then one of them is getting sent away to live in South Africa for her health. And the other one is like devastated and in this sort of delusional way blames her mom for her not being able to go with her, which is like sort of true in that her mom won't approve of her getting a passport, but the delusional part being that like it's quite hard to just up and move to South Africa at the drop of a hat.
Yes.
And so it's not like her mom is being entirely unreasonable here. And so they come up with this plan to kill her mother with the idea in their heads that that will allow them to go to South Africa together, which you don't see in the movie, but it's explained at the end that no, in fact, literally the next day, people investigated this murder because, you know, that's what happens. And they found her diaries talking about their plan to murder her. And then they were arrested.
Whoops.
So they did not, in fact, go to South Africa.
Instead, they probably went to like somebody's school for criminally troubled girls or something.
Actually, no. Here is an interesting thing. I was reading a little bit of analysis of the film and the case itself, and they were both sent to prison, separate prisons. But interestingly, they were both released after 5 years on the condition that they never see each other again, which someone made the point that, and obviously, like, if you murder someone, there should be consequences. But if you compare that to the sentences that are typically handed down for murder, especially crimes that are viewed as being like really, I guess, unnatural, like that, like matricide, the sentences are typically much higher. And so what this random person on the internet who wrote this essay about the movie said was that like, that really kind of suggests that it's not actually the murder that people wanted to punish. It was this intense, like, again, unnatural, not socially expected relationship between the two.
Mm.
Right? Because if you were like, we have to punish the murder and we have to keep these murderers from murdering again, you'd give them a long sentence.
Right.
You wouldn't release them after a couple of years on the condition that they not see each other anymore.
So it's almost like what we're really uncomfortable with is the possibility that these two women are in love with each other.
Yeah, and I don't think it even has to be. And I mean, the film itself and the actual facts of the case are really ambiguous. There is the suggestion, like the girl whose mom they murder gets taken to, again, a therapist. The real lesson of these movies is, I guess, don't trust therapists from the early 1900s, who basically then starts telling her parents that, like, oh, she is a homosexual, blah, blah, blah. And yeah, so that's like, it's then, like, I think they have sex at some point in the movie, but it's not like there's a lot of debate over whether or not they were actually in a romantic and sexual relationship or if it was just a really intense friendship and a really obsessive friendship. But I don't think it necessarily matters because I think you can describe the relationship as queer either way because it exists outside of the bounds of acceptable friendships. It's, a relationship between two women to the exclusion of the other relationships that we place value on, especially relationships with men.
So that to you is what makes this, and all of these, we say horror, but like are really kind of more thriller movies than horror movies, I think.
Yeah.
What ties this in that kind of relationship between those sorts of movies and queerness is just that, I mean, the crime obviously is murder, but what makes it a story is this unusual relationship and how uncomfortable that is for the people around them.
Right. And I mean, what led to her mom being so resistant? Because it wasn't just that, oh, she won't give me a passport to go with her. It was sort of this conspiracy that the parents had going on that was like, we don't like the way that these two girls are with each other. We're going to try to start keeping them apart. And it was that attitude that also led to, I think, this feeling of intense hatred towards her mom. And I mean, you can see in the movie also, like, she really, like, the mom sort of unfairly becomes the scapegoat in this girl's mind, Paulina Paul, because all four of the parents involved are making decisions and talking to each other and being like, we did like this. And it's actually the other girl's dad, who's a professor, who is the one who is like, she needs to go to therapy because this is unacceptable, blah, 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 blah. But she has him sort of built up as this like wonderful mythical figure who's wonderful and amazing. And all of the negativity and all of the anger gets directed towards her own mom.
Right. And then we were talking about that, and you said that there's a long history of conflict between lesbians and their mothers.
Yeah. And I mean, I think it's like an extension because I think in general, it's not unusual for parents to have closer relationships with their children of a different gender. We talk about like mommy's boys and daddy's girls, and that's like a very established thing. But I think it tends to get taken to a more toxic level when it comes to relationships between queer kids and their parents of the same gender. I think because there are all of these expectations that get projected onto kids by their parents. And I mean, that happens with straight kids too. But I think because queerness is something that A, has this level of stigma attached in society, and B, is really kind of a fundamental difference in the way that you experience the world, that it is it becomes more difficult for parents to maybe bridge that gap of like, this kid isn't who I expected them to be.
Yeah, we've talked about all the like psychological baggage there of like seeing the child of the same gender not following in your footsteps or being like you, as feeling like an actual rejection of who you are.
Mm-hmm.
And then, yeah, I suppose with something that is so tied to identity, not just like you don't want to play the same sport, but like who you are, then there's a lot. It becomes like really emotionally fraught.
Right. And so, I mean, obviously, that's true for queer men and their fathers. But that the interesting thing, I guess, is that tends to be a very explicitly violent dynamic in the way that it's portrayed typically. In having like abusive fathers who can't handle their son being queer. Whereas the dynamic between mothers and their queer daughters tends to be portrayed as a less explicitly violent one. And so I guess what's interesting about this film or this story is that undercurrent of like manipulation and resentment does become explicitly violent.
Yeah. I just found the movie terrifying, and I didn't even have kids yet. Just you know, like I remember watching the movie and I don't remember if one of them was more one way than the other, but like it sort of seemed like one of them was under the influence of the other. Did that come across to you?
It really varied, I guess. You know, there were times when it seemed like Paul was really being manipulated, or that there were things that the other girl was doing that were very toxic, but it wasn't exactly consistent.
I just remember feeling like how horrifying to imagine your child being in a relationship with somebody that, like, regardless of anything else about it, like, seems like it is unhealthy and bringing out the worst in them. And as a parent, trying to intervene and being killed for it. Like, I just thought that was just terrifying.
Which is really interesting because while that is like obviously a completely valid fear, in that, you know, clearly her mom thinks she's doing what is best and trying to help her daughter, and people shouldn't die for that. It's also, it's really consistent, I think, with the way that a lot of queer relationships, especially relationships between women, are treated, in that, like, oh, there's this horrible outside influence that's corrupting my daughter and ruining our relationship.
Yeah.
And so, you know, when you watch that from a queer perspective, I think that, again, although we don't excuse or condone murder, that what's hard to watch is it brings up feelings of like, my relationship is being treated like something evil. The person I love is being demonized.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And so it's just interesting, these two different perspectives. And I think it's also not uncommon for queer women to grow up with relationships that probably aren't like friendships that probably aren't super healthy, because there isn't really a cultural framework or recognition, right? Like, if you have it's actually a real problem, right? If we see a little boy and a little girl who have a close relationship, the immediate reaction is, oh, they're in love, they're going to get married. And that is also problematic because it leaves no room for friendships between people of opposite genders. But there is no mechanism for recognizing a relationship between two girls that might not be in the bounds of friendship, that might be more equivalent to like a little kid crush. And so that obsession sort of is allowed to grow without any mediating force. That idea of like, oh, this is something different. This isn't a friendship. And so when you're not drawing distinctions, right, as adults, there are there are elements of our relationship with our romantic and sexual partners that we treat differently than we do with our friends. And it's normal for maybe a relationship with that person to be elevated or treated differently than our friendships. But if you treated one of your friends that way to the exclusion of other relationships, our society recognizes that very differently.
Mm.
Which one might say is problematic because we shouldn't elevate romantic relationships above all else. But that is the way our society views things. And so it's acceptable to do that with a romantic partner. It's not acceptable to do that with a friend. And I think that that creates a really toxic dynamic when a kid is trying to explore that and experiencing romantic feelings towards someone in a, you know, in an undeveloped way, without any guidance or social framework.
Mm-hmm.
That can then create really toxic dynamics and wear away at other relationships. And it's something that I experienced growing up, where there might be friendships I had where it was like, either you had different expectations from the person you were in the relationship with, and so you're viewing a relationship as, you're my favorite person in the whole world and I only want to spend time with you, and the other person is like, you're one of my friends and I like hanging out with you, but I want to hang out with other people too. and that creates an unbalanced dynamic. Or you can have two people who are both in that position. And again, having no social framework to work within, adults tend to look at that and be like, this is unhealthy.
Yeah. All sorts of interesting stuff there. All right. Last one, Jawbreaker from 1999, which I actually did watch this movie, I think pretty close to when it came out. And I really liked it. I don't know. It was this era of these like sort of candy colored high school movies with great soundtracks that I just enjoyed.
Stylistically, it's actually very similar to something like But I'm a Cheerleader.
Yeah.
Also, fun fact, look up this movie. Google will show you 3 different review sources. 2 of them give it like 20%, and then the other one gives it like 85%. So do it that way you will, I guess.
It's not for everyone. Very, very quirky and sort of disturbing. But so this movie is about this group of 4 really popular high school girls. One of them is really, really mean, and one of them is really nice. And then the other ones are kind of, one is nice in between and one is mean in between, I guess. And it starts with them deciding they're going to play this prank on the really nice one because it's her birthday, and they go kidnap her from her bed and they're going to take her out for pancakes. Unbeknownst to the other girls, the mean one thinks it would also be funny to gag her with a jawbreaker. So she sticks this jawbreaker in her mouth, tapes her mouth shut, sticks her in the trunk of the car. They get to the diner. She's dead. And the other girls are like, you gagged her with a jawbreaker? Because not a good idea. So anyway, they panic, and what turns into the plan to do is just to like cover up go put her back in her bed and pretend she was murdered. The other storyline that goes with this is there's a girl named Fern who is very, very odd and awkward and quiet and like nerdy, and everybody's mean to her. And she has this sort of fixation on the girl that was killed.
So just an observation to my previous point, though, if she were a guy and she were saying those things about this girl, we'd be like, oh, obviously he has a crush on her. But we don't categorize it in the same way because she's a girl.
So she's maybe in love with her. But yeah, I mean, you're right. It looks like a quote unquote weird fixation, right? Is how people look at it because it's a girl.
Exactly.
Yep. So anyway, she's excited to take her books to her. They call her in the girl that is dead. They say that she's out sick. So Fern's excited to go take her books to her, shows up at the house, finds out what happened. And so the deal the mean girl makes with her is, if you keep your mouth shut, we'll make you popular.
Which I feel should be contextualized with the fact that she does it in a very terrifying way, where the implication is you can do what we want and be popular, or you cannot do what we want and maybe we'll kill you too.
Yeah, it's not like...
I just feel that it does Fern a disservice to suggest that she just wants to be popular that badly.
Yes. It's a very threatening, do this or else situation. So they give Fern this big makeover and basically tell everybody that she's somebody else. Like, nobody knows she's the same girl. She looks completely different, starts acting the way these other girls act. And meanwhile, the one of the group that was like kind of nicer is horrified by the whole thing and doesn't want to hang out with them anymore because she's not really okay with like covering up this murder. So she's like on the outside, and now they're mean to her too. So she's like swapped places with Fern basically. And Fern gets meaner and meaner as she gets more swept up in this identity as one of the cool girls. And like, they basically have created a monster. Fern gets sideways with the mean girl, and Fern's on the out again, and she teams up with the other girl, and they prove the murder in the end.
Something I like about that is that, so there's this guy who's like, I guess, I don't know, a theater guy or whatever, and he's like in all the lead roles and everyone thinks he's hot or something. Also, like,
they all think he's hot, and then of course there's all the like necessary late 90s jokes about how like, but he's in theater, so you know, he's probably gay.
Yeah. And so Julie, the nice-ish one, who ends up being just nice, starts hanging out with him, and then they're in love and they're going out, and then he also like convinces her that you have to do something about this. And then it's sort of set up as though, because then the mean girls are like, Fern, you have to go like see if you can flirt with him, because imagine what a catch that would be, like whatever. And so it's set up like there's going to be like this competition subplot between Julie and Fern, but actually no, they just end up like working together, and it's cool. Which I appreciate, because men basically do nothing in this entire movie.
He helped with the sound system and
Yes.
convinced her to tell the truth. But yeah, most of the men actually are really kind of treated the way that women are treated in movies.
Yeah, they're literally just there for the mean one to be like, haha, you're hot.
Lots of fascinating little like things in there. This was an extremely homophobic group of kids who also seemed like very weirdly fixated with gayness.
Yeah.
I don't know what all that means, but yeah, if we look at this character of Fern as a queer character, there's the obvious tale of being on the outside, nobody likes you, and then trying to be somebody you're not to gain acceptance or possibly to save your life or somewhere in between. And that not being the answer. And, I thought it was kind of interesting at the prom when Julie and Fern show up together and they know that they're going to expose what really happened and they're going to get their revenge. And, all the cool girls are like laughing at them because they know Fern is a nerd and they know Julie's on the outs, and they are being all mean and actually making like jokes suggesting that they're lesbians, because that's like the worst insult they can come up with. But it's interesting that after Fern has gone through all of this and, maybe is gay, we know that Julie is probably not, but they've teamed up and they're working together and they're friends. And even though everybody's making these jokes as they're like waiting for the big reveal, they're like holding hands. And it's like this, you can be who you are and it can be okay. And you can have friends who are not like totally homophobic and aren't scared by people thinking that just because you're hanging out together, it means something. So even though it's a very weird, disturbing movie, I don't know, there were things I liked about it. There were like
I said, it's similar to But I'm a Cheerleader, in that it takes something really messed up and disturbing, and then just like throws a bunch of bright colors on it and soundtrack, and treats it almost like a joke, but in such a way, I don't know, it's like, it's interesting.
Well, and that's why I wonder why I like the mixed. If you look at it as dark comedy, like I actually think it's well done.
Mm-hmm.
If you were like, oh, it's a movie about high school girls, I could see how you were like, oh, I hated that. What was that? Yeah, like I said, not for everybody, but also interesting. I don't know. So that what ties all of these movies together is these female characters that have something about them that is different. They can feel it. Other people can see it. And just the various ways that plays out if you add sort of a murderous twist to it. If you make it something other than like a literal, traditional story, by giving these girls these sort of like very out of the ordinary characteristics, you are sort of creating these meaningful tales that I think all in their way, you can tell me if I'm wrong, but resonate with a queer person.
Yeah, and what's interesting also is to consider the way that the female characters are framed shifts over time and how the audience is expected to view them. So like Cat People was interesting because I'm like, how am I supposed to interpret this? What do you want me to think of her? Because presumably I'm supposed to think that she's like a monster or whatever, I guess. But I'm also like I said, I'm like, I don't know, seems reasonable to me.
Mm-hmm. So that is interesting that in every one of these movies, there's the character that is sort of a monster, but like you can see why and you can sympathize.
Right. And I guess all of these, to varying degrees, that might be more true for queer people than the rest of the population. I think probably most people, except perhaps religious fundamentalists, are probably very sympathetic to Carrie. But like you said, for you as a straight person watching Heavenly Creatures, the first impulse wasn't necessarily sympathy for the girls, but, fear and sympathy on behalf of the mother, which again is not an incorrect or wrong interpretation or response at all.
But yeah, that's an interesting point. My empathy immediately went to the mom.
Right. And for you, it is effective as like a scary movie. Whereas for me, I'm just kind of like, okay, well, that's a real bummer. But I didn't find it, I mean, it's disturbing, but it didn't like emotionally hit me in a frightening or disturbing way, the way it did for you.
It was kind of interesting. In a similar vein, for our next episode, we are going to start watching the new series Agatha All Along to talk about on the podcast, because we want to evaluate the Republican reaction that this show exists to turn your kids gay. We're going to see
if we can tell, because like for the simple reason that Joe Locke is in it, I guess. But as you know, we here at Queer Kid Straight Mom also love Heartstopper. So this is a great opportunity to also appreciate Joe Locke's work.
Yes, absolutely. So tune in next time. Start watching it if you want, and you'll know what we're talking about. And by the time that airs, it will officially be October and spooky season.
Unless you're me, in which case everything is bright and sunny and springtimey.
Santa is on Australia now, so summer is just starting.
Which incidentally, if you happen to hear any birds in the recording, that's why. The apartment is not very well soundproofed, and there are a lot of very noisy birds outside.
Probably cool birds, though.
I haven't actually. No, that's not true. I saw one that looked like a very dramatic black chicken yesterday. But other than that, I have seen none of the birds. I don't know what's making these noises.
Stay tuned. Until then, enjoy the beginning of fall, and we will catch you next time.
Bye.
If you found this podcast helpful, interesting, or just mildly amusing, please consider rating and reviewing us on your podcasting platform of choice. It really helps us to get the word out there and spread this information as far as we can.
And as always, check out our website at queerkidsstraightmom.com or visit us on Facebook, Queer Kid Straight Mom, Instagram at queerkid.straightmom, or Twitter at queerkidstr8mom.
And if you're feeling especially generous, please consider joining our Patreon by searching Queer Kids Straight Mom. It helps us fund this podcast.